Good morning, all. My name is Julius Gombos. I'm Senior Vice President, Project Delivery with Waterfront Toronto. Today, we're going to give you a bit of an overview on Waterfront, what we're doing, and then take you using a series of construction cameras onto the site and show you different aspects of the project as it is live. And I'll get into details of where we are in the process. Oh, excuse me, where we are in the process and when we're going to wrap this up. So let you know when people can come and visit the completed product. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. We'd like to acknowledge that the land upon which we're undertaking our revitalization efforts is part of the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is home of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We do this typically because this is part of treaty property, and I would say that the Mississaugas of the Credit in particular have been involved with the project from the outset, attending on site as we've excavated the site. We'll get into some of the details of how they've had input into the process to date and on a continuing basis. Next slide. Waterfront Toronto is a government agency that was thought of early and created in the early 2000s by the city, the province, and federal governments combined to find ways to deal with revitalization of Toronto's waterfront on an integrated basis. There was an initial $1.5 billion of funding provided to get the agency moving. And a lot of the work involved infrastructure, creating a public realm, cleaning up of brownfield contaminated lands, and then fostering economic development and new residential development. So making it a place for people to go, a place for people to enjoy the waterfront and make it more accessible. If we go back 20 years, 30 years, it really was an industrial area that really did not engage with the public in any meaningful way. Next slide, please. So this is an image of where we started, of a section of the waterfront. You can see the Red Path facility on the left margin of the site, which was an early industrial development that remains on site. In the center section, that's where the Chorus development today is, where George Brown College is. And on the left, or rather the right side of the screen, this is where Bayside is developed. The new Quayside development is being developed just to the north of that. And then we see the Parliament Slip that we're going to touch on a bit today. So these are areas that are under development now, and as you're going to see some images as how that's changed over time. Next. Be collaborative. So waterfront, through our ownership, is required, and is a core value of our ongoing business, is to engage with the public, to go through market soundings, to go through public engagement, discussion, and dialogue, to see what people want to have done, work towards consensus as best that we can, and then get things done tied to those plans and the input that we provide. So that's been a core foundational piece of what we do. That did tie directly into the environmental assessment of the Portlands in Toronto that ultimately led to the flood protection project that I'm going to talk about. Next. Always demand better. So we do push the envelope by way of design as Waterfront Toronto brings property to market. We do push the development community for innovation from an energy standpoint, design standpoint, every standpoint that we can, making accommodation for affordable housing in the process as well. This particular development is in the West Donlands area, in the area of what was the Pan Am Village, which is protected by a flood protection landform we're going to touch on today. Next. And this is that flood protection landform. So on the west side of the river, a good few years back, aligned with the Pan Am Village, we looked at flood protection both for the Portlands and for downtown Toronto. In the 50s, there was a major storm event called Hurricane Hazel that flooded the Humber River, where a hurricane, remnants of a hurricane, parked over the catchment area of that river, causing massive floods, bridge collapses, housing collapses. People lost their lives. So this was taken seriously, and restrictions were put on development in the area of both the Humber and Don Rivers, pending flood protection structures to put in place to save people, lives, and property. So the first effort was on the west side to protect downtown. Now we're working on the south and east. Next. So we've touched on briefly the cleanup of post-industrial lands, and I should touch on the Portlands proper in particular. The Portlands in Toronto were actually built over one of the largest marshes in the Great Lakes. This was a very old, established marsh at the bottom of the Don River. And when they decided to fill it in, they took dredging from the bottom of the Toronto Harbor and then capped it with basement excavations from the city. The result of that, though, is a series of layers of peat, which is organic matter from what was the marsh, combined with sand, and it's flowing sand, so it's been rounded through water action over an extended period of time, which makes it structurally unstable. So the Portlands really are held together by dock walls on the perimeter of the land, and then we run foundations down into the bedrock below, which is generally somewhere 20 meters to 40 some odd meters below the surface today. So when that work was completed, the industry never came that was expected, so it wound up being oil storage primarily, asphalt production, things like that. The oil tanks rotted out at the bottom, pressing the oil into the ground, resulting in highly contaminated soils throughout the Portlands, which is something we had to deal with in completing, or as we work our way through the Portlands Flood Protection Project. Next. Here you can start to see some of the results of activity by Waterfront and other government agencies. You can see the promenade extending along the waterfront. This is down east of York Street, or rather west of York Street. So you can see marinas are weaving in, and we're looking to expand that further to the east along Queens Quay in time. Next. This is down by George Brown College in the background. The chorus building is in the same area. This is a completed waterfront promenade. It's now being extended farther to the east past the Hines Tridel development into the Parliament Slip. We're going to touch a bit on the Parliament Slip today because we have some exciting plans for that as well. As you can see, it's quite beautiful now. So this was taken in the fall as an image showing the trees in place. Quite nice. I encourage all to go down. Next. So we have other things coming up. Parliament Slip, for example. We've acquired the slip from Ports Toronto, and we're looking to fill in portions of it with new docks, canoe coves, pools, water transportation hub, some floating wetlands, wave deck, and amenities, and an amphitheater as well. So there's a series of things that are planned tied to the quayside development that surrounds it, and then what will happen within the slip itself as we work our way through completing this area. Next. This is an aerial of the Portlands Flood Protection Project. This was taken last summer, so quite a bit of work has happened since. You can see in the center of the image, though, that curvilinear form, which becomes the river. And you can see the Don River, where the Gardner and the highway meet. And then there's a third overflow I'll show a little bit later into this presentation as to how we've set up 3 ways for the water to move through this area, and how we're modifying the bridges at Lakeshore as well, which is a key part of flood protection. I'm working a parallel screen here so that we stay on top of things. So this is an image of the finished project, most of it anyway. This doesn't show the sediment management area, which is to the north of Lakeshore Bridge. Um, we'll show a bit more of that today, and certainly we'll show it in the live camera shots that we take. So when we look at this image, originally you had the Don River coming down, passing under two spans of bridge at Lakeshore, and then making a 90-degree turn into the Keating Channel. In a major flood event, major storm event, you will get 2/3 of the volume of Niagara Falls trying to pass through that opening. That's the reason for the flooding. So what would happen in a flood event before flood protection is that the bridge itself would effectively become a plug. Limited water would go through, and it would try to find its way through to the east or to the west, and flood those lands, traveling at about 50 kilometers an hour, 1 to 2 meters deep. Again, in a major event, that could cost lives, certainly property damage to an extreme. Water has a way of finding its own way, so would have caused material damage structurally to the entire area. So when we, as part of this, we're extending then the bridge. The bridge is being extended by 2 bays. And one thing that was important to people that caused a lot of concern, and we've dealt with this best we can, but we needed to pull down the Gardner ramps, which were over Lakeshore Bridge, and that we needed to both lengthen and widen the bridges. Originally, the plan was to do it in two different phases, one taking 2 years to originally extend the bridge, then leave it operational, then come back over another 2-3 years later, widen the bridges to finish the work. So what we've done is, rather than do that and have the extreme danger of working with the Gardner ramps directly over the bridge work underneath, we wound up looking to pull the ramps down and work in a stable environment to make sure that people stayed safe. In turn, we took what would have been a 6-year program of a lot of disruption and compressed it into 2. Now, when we look at the river overall, you can see now the new curved shape of the river, naturalizing it. This has really been designed by MVVA, a world-leading architectural firm based in New York City and Boston. So we're very sensitive in terms of what the plantings are, how it's shaped, and how it performs with different levels of water flow running through the area. And then for a major flood event, directly down from the Don River where it hits the Keating Channel, you can see there's an overflow area to the ship channel to the south, so towards the bottom of the page. So we've effectively created 3 routes for water to deal with water under different conditions. So that's the overview. With this, we're also building a series of parks. You can see Promontory Park South on the left side of the page. There's River Park North, following along the river between what is Commissioners and the river. And on the south, we have River Park South. Here's our friend Rocky Radar. So we have some very specialized equipment that we've been using as we excavate this work. Part of that was using deep excavation equipment where we actually cut into bedrock. And this was a special tool that was developed to use with excavators for that. So we popped a couple of eyeballs on it, and it became quite popular with the kids. So we do maintain Rocky the Radar updates for the public, and let's see if you can spot the eyeballs on the equipment as we go through today's presentation. Now, I've touched on the different areas of work on the previous image. Here we can see the sediment management area I touched on earlier at the top of the sheet. So it's quite an extensive area of work. We've pretty well completed excavation for the entire river now. You can see that in the pulse and slip towards the left of the page, the left of the image, there is a Canoe Cove area that we've carved in to naturalize that area. So you'll be able to get down to the water there and elsewhere around the island. Now, in the center, what you see is now Villiers Island. This is a new island being created through the routing of the river. And effectively to the south, in a major flood event, you wind up with a second island, which would be South River. Um, the industrial uses, the clubs and so on that are out on Polson Slip or Polson Pier remain in place, and that's under separate ownership. You can see, though, towards the bottom, just to put this into context, there's those two round images. They're holding tanks. As we've completed excavation here, and we've excavated 1.4 million cubic meters of soil, all of which is contaminated, all of which we've cleaned. We've disposed of about 10% of that because of metal content or some specialized problem that we couldn't manage, but 90% has been reused. In parallel, we've had to effectively dewater the lake. So every day we are pumping out, and first we have to treat the water. So we have to clean the water, get any oil or grit out of the water, clean it to standards that are above what the lake standards are, treat it fully, and then put it back into the harbor. So 2.5 million liters a day on average since starting the project. Next. And we put some rocky eyes on there. Here we see some of the excavation work. This is fairly early on. In the background, those are called secant piles. We put in 1,400 of those, and every second one has a steel column in between. What they do is they actually go from the surface, what would be the top of the river in a storm event, down into bedrock, which would be 20 meters to 40 meters below, and would actually key it into the bedrock so that in a major storm event, the structure won't move. This also then helped us as we excavated to keep the water pressure of the lake and harbor from pushing back into the excavation. So even with all that work being done, the 2.5 million liters a day still had to be dealt with. So as we've now then started to recreate the river, in this image, we're looking at some of the finishes being put in place. We can go ahead to the next one. We've continued as we reuse the material. We bring in large rock sections for structural reinforcement. In the foreground or in the center, you see these canvas enclosed soil packets that'll be supporting planting, allowing planting to stabilize as we flood the area. We'll be opening the west end, the West River plug in the Polson Channel or Polson Slip next year, allowing water to come into the river and flooding it, and then allowing a year for the planting to stabilize. Then we'll open the north plug at Lakeshore, and then we'll allow water to flow through, which will be in 2020. Next. As part of the program, we put in bridges, roads, utilities, and this was quite complex. Again, the soil stability is quite a problem. So we've had to put in special structures to hold up pipes, hold up roads. It's quite labor intensive, quite costly a process, but this is the way we needed to do all the work. So in this case, these are the Commissioner Street bridges. They were shipped in from Nova Scotia by barge and then offloaded in the ship channel. We built roads to drive them onto the site in two sections, and we put them in place. So we built the roads up to roughly the level where the bridges are now, and then excavated under the bridges once the foundations were in place. And then we put in our structures and environmental barriers that keep any oil from coming back out of the ground into the river and into the harbor. So it's a different way to do things, but you build a bridge first, you dig the river after. Next. So now we're going to go exploring. So you need to put on your safety gear, which we'll virtually give you right here. When we go on site, we need to wear hard hats, safety glasses, safety boots, and vests. It is a dangerous environment because we have what's effectively more a mining operation by way of the type of equipment being used as compared to normal construction that you might expect to see elsewhere. So as we get into the camera images on site, you'll see some of the equipment, which is quite significant. Now, this is live streamed, so the cameras do drop off at times. I will be pivoting around, showing different areas and highlighting different areas, but I will start where I usually start, which is here, which is at the Don Roadway and, the Don Roadway and Lakeshore. So I'm just going to rotate the camera here a little bit. Now here you can see one of the Lakeshore bridges has already been removed. So we're putting in new foundations to widen the bridge, and then we'll be moving to the west, excavating underneath after we put in the new foundations. Then again, as we have with the other bridge to the south, we'll excavate underneath once we've got the foundations in place. So that'll effectively double the area that water can flow through in this area. In the background, you can see the old Gardner ramps where they've been cut off. So again, you can see that we're doing work directly underneath, and the large equipment isn't here right now. The strike just ended where we were working with piling contractors to get the foundations in place in this area. So there was headroom issues with the bridges overhead as well. So all that's been addressed by pulling the ramps down. This is the rail bridge that remains a little bit contentious in terms of providing rail access to the Portlands. It is barely used, so we'll see what City Council ultimately decides to do with it. And here, rotating a little bit more to the north, if the camera will cooperate. This is the sediment management area, so we'll be going back beyond the Gardner ramps, excavating this down to below water level. And this will allow for water flow to reach out the full width of the widened area that we talked about earlier. In time, the Gardner ramps will be taken down here as well, with the entire Gardner Expressway and the ramps moving to the Don Valley Parkway, moving much farther to the north, right beside the railway staging yards that you see in the background.
Julius, we just have
Sorry?
We've got a question here from Ethan. And is there a way of capturing how big the project is? Example, the number of people working on it, amount of soil moved, etc. Seems like this must be one of the largest and most complex projects underway in Canada right now.
It is. So in terms of soil moved, it is 1.4 million cubic meters of excavated material and clean material. The project value is at 1.25 billion. What I should note, though, is that upon completion, it impacts land value in the area. So prior to flood protection, land would be worth $2 to $4 million per acre. It's contaminated, unstable, and limited in use to basically one-story industrial. On completion, you can build whatever you'd like on those lands, with the land value increasing from $30 to $50 million per acre. And hopefully, some benefit to the city out of the yield that comes out of that. So yeah, it is enough to fill up the SkyDome. Thank you. Good. All right, I'm going to switch cameras now. We're going to look a little bit to the south. There we go. First, I'm looking north still. So there you can see the two spans of bridge that we start with. And here you can see the areas that we're going to be widening. So this will be extended to about here as an open area for water flow moving south. And that's roughly where the river mouth will be heading directly to the south. So all this where you see these vehicles and trailers parked will be excavated. This is what we call the north plug. So this will be the last section removed that allow for the water flow through the river to take place. On this side, this is the Don roadway. We've closed it temporarily, but this section following the edge of the river is a flood protection landform. So it's a specialized structure that's been created with a clay core put in place so that water can't go underneath it or can't push through it. If you build a wall, if you look at what happened in New Orleans, the water pressure can actually wash out underneath the wall and cause a failure. These structures are set up so that there's no way for the water to get there. So it's quite a complex piece of engineering that got done, and it was the only structure that was deemed acceptable by the Ministry of the Environment to work under these extreme conditions. So I'm going to rotate the camera around a little bit now, in two directions, actually. First to the east. It's a little slow. But here you can see some hydro towers that we had to relocate. And at the base of the towers, you can see the galvanized steel. The ground will be raised by another 1.5 meters from where it is currently in this area, as will the Don roadway. So we need to have structures at a certain height in the area, depending on what the flow characteristics are. So in the river area itself, the ground levels will be increasing between 1.5 and 3 meters, typically, from a containment standpoint, and then will be sloped back down as we move away from the river. I'm going to rotate the other way now. Here we're looking at Villiers Street, and a lot of this will be removed because what you see here in the foreground is the river. Where my cursor is now would be the west edge of the river valley on completion. And what we're seeing here in the foreground, I'll show in more detail, but is the beginning of the bottom of the riverbed, which is placed on top of a series of layers that are structural and are put in place to contain any contaminants that could come back out of the ground. So Villiers here will be cut off back in this area, and there'll be a new road installed moving to the south, connecting to Commissioner Street that I'll get to in a minute. And then some of these buildings are historically designated, so the city will need to decide what they do with those properties as redevelopment takes place. My apologies, it's slow. That's just the nature of the beast that we're dealing with. So here's the Commissioner Street Bridge. You can see how we've excavated underneath. This is the width of the river valley, so it is significant. And then here you see this rock, which will ultimately be the bottom of the river. So this will all be underground. Underneath this, then we've got layers of waterproof membrane, charcoal impregnated filter cloth, sand, clay. So it's a series of layers that we've built up for structural purposes to avoid scrubs so that the materials aren't washed away in a major storm event. So it's a complex process. And then, towards the edges, we do use large rock to keep things in place because ice does form up every winter. And we've got to have the banks of the river be able to withstand the pressures that the ice would put on the structure itself. Now, here in the foreground, here's one of our little dump trucks. So again, this is the type of equipment we're using, which is more mining related, with a vast number of machines on the site at any given time. There was a question about the number of people on site. So typical day might have about 200 workers on site. This is heavily mechanized. So there's not much done with a shovel and a pail here. Heavy excavators, bulldozers, large transportation units such as this, and then off-site work by way of mining for the rock, gravel, or other rock from quarries, steel fabrication being done in the Netherlands to form the bridges, building the bridges themselves being done in Nova Scotia. So that's the entire output of a shipbuilding plant for a couple of years, just building these bridges as examples. So, in total, there are thousands of people involved in this program. When you look into the consultants, government partners, labor on site, and the offsite fabrication that takes place. In the background here, you can see, yes.
Of the membrane in the riverbed.
This is typically mined in Ontario from different locations. So depending on the size of the rock, the type of the rock that we need, a lot of this came in from the Peterborough area and then is shipped down to the waterfront there and then brought in by ship. So primarily those areas. You don't want to be going too far for that material because shipping is quite expensive. So we've been successful that way in sourcing the material. So again, this is where the Don roadway is going to wind up. This is Pinewood Studios off to the side. So we've had to do things in a manner that allowed production to continue without disruption in the studios. And then in the background, you see these large mounds. These are areas where we store soil and we process soil. So as we excavate the soil, we place microbes into the soil that actually consume hydrocarbons. So we then rotate the soil, put more chemical in, and then monitor that and then test the soil as the hydrocarbon content breaks down. In parallel, we remove any large concrete that's been excavated. So we found old foundations, we find old structural elements, timber, all that's cleaned out. We run it through fines so that we have got good predictability and structural capacity and what the content is of that material. So throughout the site, you're going to see storage mounds. They're all labeled and tracked, and then we place them into a final position for completion. Here. And I was looking for my friend Rocky, but I guess I missed him.
I think he's on camera 3.
All right. So let's just see if there's another view here that I want to take. That's the ship channel, by the way, in the background. So that's the extent of the site. The site itself in acres is about 250 acres. So that would be the size of all of downtown Toronto. And on completion, the project will free up 800 acres for development within 5 minutes of downtown Toronto. So this is significant. From here, the river continues and then turns. So I'm going to switch over to another camera to show you. Wrong one.
You can see Rocky in that one, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And actually,
there's Rocky.
Julius, I'm sorry, I was having issues with my audio, but I think there was one other question, which I answered in the chat, but it's what is the purpose of the membrane in the riverbed?
Primarily containment of hydrocarbons. So there's soil that we didn't excavate that remains in place underneath the membrane. So we went down a certain distance, we over excavated, then we put some clean fill on top of that, and then we started to layer up these barriers to keep hydrocarbons from coming back up from the ground and entering the river itself. So what we didn't want was to have any rainbow forming up in the harbor or in the river itself. To explain the Portland's overall, the water pressure from the lake and the harbor press in to the structure. So there's less density in the ground within the Portlands than there is in the water. So that's what keeps the oil from coming out and contaminating the lake. So we want to make sure that as we complete this project, that those same hydrostatic pressures don't wind up pushing the oil back out into the river. So we put those membranes in place and then set them in place in a manner through equalizing pressure between water pressure above and below to get it equalized so that we're not getting any distortion of the structure and we keep the hydrocarbons contained. Okay, so this now is looking from the west to the east. And again, we can see now in the distance, and this starts giving you an idea of the size of this site. That's the Commissioner Street Bridge off in the distance. There's Pinewood Studios off in the distance. And the river is started where my cursor is here, and then followed down south under the Commissioner Street Bridge. You see this mound is in the way screening things, but the river then turns here and then begins this meander through that will come out underneath this bridge in the foreground. This is the Cherry Street South Bridge. This section of Cherry Street in the background then will be closed as it will be in the river. So we're going to reroute Cherry Street to the west. I'll show you a bit more about that today. Currently, we're putting in gas lines that go underneath the river. This will service areas to the south. So we've got to deal with water supply, stormwater, sewage, gas, hydro, communications, cabling, other utilities all have to be adjusted and rebuilt for bigger capacity, for more dense development. And all that needs to happen concurrent with the work that we're doing with the flood protection itself. So it's a very, very complex series of parts and pieces that we've got to work to get done. Here's another interesting piece. This is the old fire hall. This was located on Commissioner Street out about here. And with the new alignment of Cherry Street, or rather Commissioners, there's accommodation for transit ultimately here through LRT in time. So we've moved the fire hall back, which was kind of an interesting piece of work where we had to build a steel frame underneath the building, build a new foundation for it, and then physically move the building to the south quite a distance. So this ultimately then will become public space, washrooms for use in the parks. Another thing that's interesting is the bridges themselves. This is orange on Commissioners. The Cherry Street Bridge south is yellow. And just look to the north a little bit here. There's the Cherry Street North Bridge. There's a second one that's coming shortly. This one is for transit. There'll be another one beside it for vehicles and people. And this one is finished in red. So part of the plan here was to give it some interest. This was a international design team that designed the bridges, including some local support with Intuitive. So we had a real range of specialist consultants involved in this as well. But you wind up being able to orient people because we've got large parks that are in this area as well. So we'll meet you at the red bridge, the orange bridge, the yellow bridge, things like that that are helpful. The bridges also all have large walkways on them and accommodation for bikes so that people can go out there and get some great views. I would argue that the views from Villiers and from South River are the best in the city because they frame downtown beautifully. You're on the water, so you get all the benefits of sight lines towards the water. But the unique thing here is that you get this framed view of downtown as well. So it's pretty spectacular. So here in the foreground, or right in the center, actually, again, this is where Cherry Street will be. So it will line up with the bridge here, turn slightly, and then move to the north. And we are realigning and rebuilding the intersection of Lakeshore and Cherry Street as well to simplify that. And we'll be removing the old lift bridge that's on Cherry Street currently. What I can't show you, the camera won't go that far, so is a major portion of the site. I'd say almost a third of the site is beyond this line, moving to the west. So Canoe Cove that I touched on with the excavation and the naturalization of the river mouth is happening just below there. Promontory Park South and North will be built in those areas. And then there's room for development residential development in particular, including affordable housing, planned to fill in Villiers Island. There are other uses planned in the area that are residential and film and entertainment related, and that's being controlled by another agency called CreateTO.
So actually, Julius, just speaking of development, someone asked if we could expand a bit on the 250 acres freeing up 800 acres for development and
Sure.
how that works in Parks and Public Realm.
So when you look back at the maps that we showed earlier in the project or in this presentation, it showed the construction site area. And that's about 250 acres. So that is what you're seeing here in the camera. It extends to the north of Lakeshore, stops just east of the Don roadway, and then covers the lands to the west. So that's about 250 acres. The 800 acres extends from Eastern Avenue south to the lake as far as Carlaw. I think actually beyond Carlaw. So we do have that online on our website, which does show some details of flood protection. And if you go back and look at the recording of this show, you'll be able to see on the drawings we provided where that 250 acre is. But generally speaking, the 800 acres would be the remainder of the Portlands, everything south of Eastern Avenue. So I don't know that I can show much more because of the limitations of the camera. So I open it up to questions and answers at this point.
Actually, Julius, there's one other question here. How do you make sure the various contractors, companies, etc., are staying on time and working efficiently?
Well, everything is scheduled in a planned manner with the subtrades. So we built our original schedule and built accommodation in to make adjustments to the schedule as we went along, realizing that we might have some challenges with approvals. For example, dealing with Toronto Hydro or Enbridge are a protracted process. They're monopolies. They have a process to run through, but you may or may not get the approvals you need quite when you'd like to have them. So we built float into the schedule to deal with those things. And we're able to move things around here and there in the program so that our end date isn't materially impacted. Right now, we're on plan to complete in 2024. I don't see any reason that we won't be done. The river itself will be open in the spring, late spring, early summer of 2024 fully. We'll be doing a bit of landscaping through the rest of the year, but the public will have access to it certainly by mid-2024. So we've been able to manage the schedule well.
Another question is a little bit on the river finishes in the Central River Valley here. And I wonder if you could maybe zoom in and show some of the crib walls and the FES lifts in the central section.
Mm-hmm. I'll zoom in a bit. So here, these are crib walls. What we've done is we've pulled out trees, including the roots, and then lay them on the ground in a mesh, and then tie them together with rock and steel cables, so that they become fish habitat. One, two, they provide a structure that stabilizes the ground in a scrub event. So if you're in a major storm again, where you've got these bends, you'll have significant scrubbing happening against those surfaces. And this type of structure helps stabilize that. Then here, these lifts are how we establish planting. So we'll be opening the plug down at this end by the Yellow River, by the South River, or by the South plug. Water will flood back in. These structures will be seeded, and then the planting will come up from that, but it allows a stable structure for the planting to start in. So those are two examples. And then the river base itself is made of crushed rock, typically about 4 inches on average. And this has been sized based on, again, scrub requirements so that in a major event, that rock will remain in place. So those are the basic elements that you'll see. You see we've started to plant certain trees in different locations. There'll be 2 million plants and trees placed across the site over the next 2 years. So we ordered those some time ago, and they've been growing merrily on farms. The trees certainly aren't going to look like what we'd like them to look like, as you see in the background with Macella. That'll take a little bit of time, but there'll be smaller trees, smaller caliper, and over the next 10, 15 years will fill out nicely as they have along the waterfront promenade. So there'll be low-level planting that'll start up, and then things will grow from there fairly quickly. If you look at the West Don lands and the park that's over there, again, that gives you an idea of the timing and how everything will grow and over time. It will look finished, though, yes.
Okay, and we've got another question. When is the new Cherry Lakeshore intersection scheduled to open? I believe it's the end of June, but Julius, I'm not sure if you have more information.
Yeah, it will be this summer. So we're just wrapping things up in that area. Final date I don't have, but we can check on that.
Yeah. And what agency is responsible for the plans for the historic buildings?
So that's a complex process. So first, there is properties can be designated as heritage, and I believe in those cases they have been. Then there's an evaluation process that takes place as to what to do with the building. Is it salvageable or not? If it is salvageable, then how can it be reused adaptively? Does it become part of another building? Do you keep it as it is? So that's a process. Or if it is, structurally unsound, there's really nothing salvageable, then we might still look at it by way of footprint, by way of some detail, or elements of the building that we might reuse elsewhere. As an example, MT35 this was a little bit odd because it wasn't that old, but MT35 was the last industrial building that was for shipping purposes that was along the west edge of the development area on the harbor. And that building burned down just as we were starting this project. So it was designated because of the fire. It wasn't salvageable, but we took then some of the steel framing from that building, which had some unique diamond cut plate beams, and we're using those on pedestrian bridges that will be crossing the river, so that where you have bicycles and footpath, we're going to have a series of bridges that cross the river valley, and we're going to use those elements there. So there's different ways we find to adapt and reuse as best we can. Again, there's a series of steps to go through.
Okay, and when is the rest of the Cherry Street North Bridge expected to arrive?
That's within the next 2 months.
And what is the process to actually release water into the area? That's a cool question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a very careful process. We open in the bottom here, you can see, I'm just going to zoom back, but this is called the West Plug. So it'll be in this area where we'll start to open it up, and it'll be a smaller opening. It'll allow for, I'd say, a slow staged buildup of water within the river valley. So we'll make an opening. We'll begin to flow the water back in. We'll allow it to fill up to lake level, and then let it sit for about a year. And then we'll pull the north plug once it's stabilized. So it's a slow process to make sure that the planting doesn't get washed away. It allows planting time to settle and not be damaged.
And another question is the southern bridge on Cherry getting rehabilitated. Are you asking about the lift bridge over the ship channel? Sounds like it might be. I think that one is actually overseen.
Yeah, there is a restoration program that's underway on that. I believe that is either Ports Toronto or the city doing that work. That's outside the scope of this project. But it gives you an idea. We have to coordinate with everybody. So we deal with CreateTO, we deal with TRCA, we deal with Ports Toronto, we deal with Aquatic Habitat Toronto, We deal with the Ministry of the Environment. We deal with the city, the province, and the federal governments. We deal with the public, obviously. So there are many, many people that we deal with every single day to keep people advised. For example, the East Harbor development that Cadillac Fairview is pushing forward with the new train station and subway station, the occupancy and development of that site is contingent on us completing flood protection. So we're working with them hand in hand, and also working with them to find ways to avoid digging up lakeshore yet again, for example, by putting in pipes to accommodate that development as we rebuild lakeshore, as opposed to having them come back in 2 years later and tear it all up again. So the bridge is one of those, lakeshore is another.
Okay, and a follow-up on the Heritage Building, asking if there is a specific agency that deals with all of them. It sounds like what you said is that there isn't one specific agency. Is that right?
Well, I think it's Heritage Toronto. So there is an agency that deals with historical designation, and then ultimately it goes back to City Council to determine, how things might proceed. And that decision is generally based on input by specialized architects that deal with heritage facilities, who assess what the building is and then make recommendations for reuse or how it might be reused or restored.
Okay, and we've also got a question. This is on the biking and walking routes in the Portlands. I think this question might be better addressed if you were to email us, because you've got a couple specific things. So if you could just send us an email at info@waterfronttoronto.ca, we'll make sure that it gets to the right people on the team to make sure we're addressing all of your questions here. And then another question on the river. Has it been plugged since 1918? I guess
It's never been plugged. So the river was straightened. I see Andrea's posted an image of what the river used to look like, which was a meandering structure. So no, it's never been plugged, but it certainly was straightened. So what you see coming down the Don Valley is a structure that was put in place through, some engineering that was colorful back in the day. That drawing itself actually shows the right-hand turn that you would hit at the bottom of the river. I should note, though, that flooding will continue upriver for a good reason. So for whatever reason, roads and rail were built in the floodplain. And that's the reason that you're getting that flooding every so often up the Don River Valley. So those problems will not be solved by this because they're in the floodplain itself. What we're dealing with then is moving things out of floodplain. We can't impact that area, so that requires separate work.
Great. And this one is sort of a two-parter. Will there be a new marsh created with the new river valley? And do you think that birds will end up adding it to their migration routes?
Marshes, for sure. So that third area that I talked about as the third overflow will be a wetland. So you've got the Gidding Channel, you've got the new river mouth, and that has a couple of marsh segments built into it. And then moving straight to the south into the Ship Channel, we were creating a wetland there. And so yes, it will be a great location for fish and fauna and birds.
Yeah, that's great. And with Googly-Eyed Rocky being a hit with kids, is there education outreach in the plans so far? Can classes access field trips in the future? I think that's actually maybe another good question to email us with. We have done things in the past, like a science fair showing some of the science and engineering behind this project. So send us an email at info@waterfronttoronto.ca, and we'll see if we can pull anything together. The Doors Open page on our website also has a couple cool interactive elements that you might want to check out with classes or kids, like a virtual reality node that you can kind of explore of what the future thing will look like. Anything to add on that one, Julius?
No, I don't think so. So I've taken the image down for now. Any other questions?
There's one more. Any previous River Valley construction like this before? Like, has anyone done something like this before?
Well, let's take the bad version. Los Angeles. So anybody seen the Terminator movies, and you've got Arnold and the kid on the motorcycle and the truck is chasing them? They built a concrete structure to try to do this. Um, so there's different ways to get this done. I don't think the concrete structure would have withstood the forces that we have here, but that's the simplistic approach that was taken elsewhere. Um, this was focused more on naturalization, and we have different ground conditions, different soil conditions to deal with. But at this scale, I don't see it. There was one project completed in the Netherlands called Room for the River, where they did something similar to reclaim some lands for development. And we had that team involved with us in due diligence and planning for this project so that we learned from their experience as to what worked and what didn't work. So we appreciated that input. And one member of that team remains with us in an advisory capacity and will remain so until we're complete.
Great. It looks like, oh, not a question, but in terms of buildings on marshy land, Mexico City is actually on a drained lake bed. Oh, who knew? Cool. It looks like that's all of the questions. Lots of people saying, thanks, Julius. Great presentation. If anyone else has any questions to put in, feel free. If you come up with anything after the fact as well, we answer tons of questions at info@waterfronttoronto.ca. You can also tweet at Rocky. He's pretty responsive, especially with more detailed construction-y questions.
Well, I think we'll do this again next year because there'll be quite a difference that people will see because the planting will have commenced. So it'll be less brown and less gray and a little more blue.
And once
So
Commissioner Street opens, you'll be able to actually
you'll be
see
able to
things
get
from the
down there.
bridge. Yeah.
Yep.
Really cool.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Julius. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's fun for us. It's difficult to see the site. People drive by and have no idea what's going on because it's all in the ground. So the only thing you can really see are the bridges at best. But now as we start to move towards opening and the finishes and flooding the river, over the next 12 months, 18 months, you'll really begin to see what's happening down there. I think it'll be very exciting. It's been a very, very challenging project.
In a good way.
In a good way.
Okay. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and thanks again.